Welcome to my book analysis on Thomas King's One Good Story, That One. I will take the next couple minutes exploring the short story and connecting to the themes that we've looked at in our ED UC 440 class. The most magical piece for me is relating it all to the First People's Principle of Learning, in which I will forever take with me into my future teaching. The first theme I wanted to touch on is learning from the land. In this story, we can see that Adam is learning and writing about the animals and plants in the garden, while Evening, in her curious mind, explores and stumbles upon a miso tree. At this point, she begins taking apples from the land without replenishing. One of the articles we read in our course is the Brayboy article about the story of the bean. The teachers in this example wanted to use the bean just for a science experiment and then disposing of the bean once it's used. In Indigenous learning, we focus on the uses of the bean for survival, looking at the seasons and constellations, as well as knowledge passed down from ancestors in order for the bean to thrive. This directly connects to the First People's Principle of Learning, that learning ultimately supports the well-being of the self, the family, the community, the land, the spirits, and the ancestors. Now back to the story. Not only do we need to respect the land that came before us, we need to nourish the land. We also need to connect with the spirits. In this case of the story, God. The next theme we will look at is world views in relations to Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge. In the Thomas King story, the tone of the white men is that they have a task at hand and they're only interested in documenting what the storyteller had to say, instead of creating a relationship with him. Evidence of this trait is mentioned in Brayboy's article, quoting that non-Indigenous people are so focused on themselves, it is a wonder they can see or hear anyone else. He also goes on to mention that Indigenous knowledge means that holistic or circular understandings do not draw separations between the body and the mind. Again, we're able to connect this to the First People's Principle of Learning, stating that learning is holistic, reflexive, experiential, and relational, focused on connectedness, on reciprocal relationships, and a sense of place. In Theme 3, we looked at the First People's Principle of Learning, that learning is embedded in memory, history, and story. One Good Story, That One, is about a story of a man telling a story. There are several connections that I want to make. Firstly, the author wanted to tell stories about his people and events that have happened near him, but the white men only wanted to hear the one about the beginning of the world. In Archibald's reading, The Power of Stories to Educate the Heart, in chapter 4, it states, a hearer isn't meant to understand the story at all levels immediately. Particularly for the Coast Salish people, the context of stories is based on the way the story is told and how one listens to the story. Another First People's Principle of Learning shown here is that learning involves patience and time. In the Archibald article, it mentions that sometimes storytellers need time to think about the story, sometimes even days, in order to come up with the story that'll fit the listener. In the Thomas King story, we can see that time and patience were not present. The storyteller was rushed along by his friend Napayo in order for the story to be recorded. Hi Angela! So I want to take the next part of our presentation to do some reflection and to go over the questions that our group discussed together. So firstly, the associations that we made in this novel, what did it raise for me and what does it remind me of? So firstly, the similarities between the Christian story of how the world came to be in terms of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. So many times during the story, the narrator, he mentioned that the garden, Evening's garden, reminded him of his and his summer place. So that was something that we noticed. The next one is the role of the trickster. So many of us decided that there were a couple tricksters in the story. Firstly being the coyote, as he kept circling around Adam and he gets dressed up, fools around and leaves his footprints. Some of us thought that the white men were like coyotes because they had an intention. They came in, recorded the story, and left right away. Some of us also thought that the storyteller could have been a trickster because he was poking fun at his visitors and they were oblivious to it. Another theme that came up was sustainability and the role of the land. Now, because Evening and Adam took from the land and God is upset, it kind of reminds us of sustainability in the modern world and how we continue to take from our land without replenishing. And eventually our resources will run dry. Another theme that came up was the role of women, and it was funny how the storyteller said that Evening was probably an Indian. She is smart, she's curious, and she explores. She's not even upset that God kicks her out of the garden. She knows there's more places that she can explore. She even has the power and knowledge to fix up Adam when he gets kicked out, and she just is okay with how things are going to go. Okay, so the next question, what do I like about the story and what stood out for me and made me want to read more? So firstly, when I read this, I just loved how the form of the story was so short and simple, but it was packed with meaning. I had to reread this over and over and over and explore and get new ideas each time. So that's the beauty of this story. I also love the humor that was used. You notice sometimes that the storyteller, he makes up things as he goes because he can't remember, or maybe he does that on purpose to see if the visitors are paying attention, and of course they don't say anything. He mentions, just go watch some television or go to the grocery store, which is not related to the time in which the story would have been told, but it was funny how he said it. So what I dislike about the story and what elements of the book I felt resistant to and why was just the inability of the white men to read the environment, how they were still oblivious to the storyteller as an elder, as a experienced person with knowledge. This reminds me of colonialism all over again, and how the settlers, how they treated the indigenous people in the past are still showing up in this story here. Another thing that I was resistant to was the destruction of our lands and how we've taken advantage of the resources that have been given to us, and we're not at all grateful, we're wasteful. So that was a little bit hard for me to think about. Now, the final question, what do I need to learn to make better sense of my reading and responses? Something that we as a group are starting to connect to is our understanding of stories and how it reflects our own beliefs and our own values. We can only judge a book based on what we know and our background knowledge. Now, another big idea that we have is around stories and how deeply rooted they are, and we need to start looking at different forms of decolonization. Another learning aspect for us is honoring the knowledge of the storyteller and allowing them to have time telling the story and giving us their knowledge and being appreciative for that. As a final piece, I wanted to mention that this story could absolutely be used in my practicum class during Indigenous Studies. Similar to what we've done here, I will ask them to pull out themes that relate to the First Peoples principle of learning and connect it to what they already know about the Indigenous people, particularly in the Coquitlam area. That concludes my book club analysis on Thomas King's One Good Story, That One. Thank you for watching.